Hello, this is Dennis Martin, and welcome to another of our sessions in the study of the Gospel of Matthew for Marion Road Christian Church. Today we're in Matthew 23. As we said earlier in our previous studies, this section of the Gospel takes us to in the last week of Jesus' life before his crucifixion. And he is in Jerusalem. He's been in Jerusalem for several days. And in chapter 23, we're on Tuesday of this last week. Jesus had arrived in near Jerusalem and arrived in Bethany on Friday evening, stayed at the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and stayed there through the Sabbath. Sunday was the triumphal entry. He entered Jerusalem and turned around and returned to Bethany. And Monday he went back to Jerusalem. He cleansed the temple. Then he returned to Bethany again. And Tuesday is a very busy day. Tuesday is the last day of Jesus' public ministry, and it takes up more than 5 chapters of Matthew's gospel, and that's where we are today. In the morning, he is in the temple, and the morning has the final confrontations and controversies with the temple authorities and all of the other Jewish leadership. And Jesus is teaching the crowds. He teaches many parables, he answers many questions, and he asks some questions of his own. And one by one, the groups of Jesus' enemies come to try to see if they can trap him in questions or in a statement. First comes the chief priests and elders. He speaks parables to the crowds for a little while. Then come the disciples, the Pharisees and the Herodians, then the Sadducees. Then he speaks to the Pharisees again. And then the leaders don't ask him questions anymore. And that's where we ended in the last session. In chapter 23, he begins speaking to the crowds. And that's where we are today. And it basically was, all of the debate is over, sort of the gloves are off, and this is how it really is, and what I really want you to know. In his final words to the crowds and the disciples, he denounces the Jewish religious leaders for their complete failure. And he starts out speaking to the crowds. He denounces the Jewish leaders for not just for their conscious hypocrisy, and that's true. They did not do what they said. But even at their best, and there were better Pharisees and there were worse Pharisees, and even at their best, they had a flawed approach to trying to please God, because they believed they could only please God by following more minute legal restrictions more closely and more carefully and more and more and more and more, and that was the only way they could possibly please God. And it was a false premise, a faulty premise. And that's partly what he criticizes them for here, but it's very severe criticism. He's speaking first of all to the crowds and to his disciples. The crowds are potential disciples, and the objective here is for them to be able to break free from this legalism that the Pharisees are teaching and are trying to get them to follow. He talks about they've seated themselves in Moses' seat, or in the chair of Moses. Some people have thought that this was the chair that sits on the raised platform in the middle of the synagogue, from which the speaker preaches. But that's probably not what it actually is. It probably refers, Moses' seat is Moses' place of authority in the law. Moses' seat is a seat of judgment on what is correct and what is not correct in terms of the law. And so that's probably what this refers to, is they they have set themselves up in Moses' place as authorities over the law. And Jesus doesn't question whether they know the law or not. What he questions is the way that they follow it and the fact that their life does not match what they say. And the problem was that with their increased legalism, it became so great that it was just not possible to follow the law, not for them, but not for the people that that were listening to them, the people that they were teaching. They had devised a system that it was not possible to follow, and they did not allow failure. There was no opportunity for grace in any of this, and so they have set the people up to fail, and they themselves are not willing to help them in the least. It says their severe failing, besides not following the law, was their pride. They wanted everyone to know how religious they were or how religious they appeared to be, and there are examples of this even in the Sermon on the Mount. This is sort of the final blow. He says they broaden their phylacteries. What in the world are phylacteries? In Deuteronomy, one of the things that is written is that God's people are to bind his word upon their foreheads and their forearms. And the Pharisees took this literally. And they wrote little words of scripture on tiny scrolls and put them in boxes and bound them with leather straps to their forehead. Sometimes they bound them to their arms, but mostly to their forehead. Now, according to their understanding of the law, these were required during morning and evening prayers. But they were the Pharisees, to show how religious they were and that they were willing to do more than was required. They wore them all day, every day, and they wore them with big thick straps on them, so that everyone would see them and everyone would know how religious they are. And they had the words of the Lord bound to their forehead all day, every day. That was just a matter of pride, because it didn't make any difference in your heart. And as we go through this lesson, you find out how important it is that people not only do or say the right things, but have the right things in their heart. It says they lengthen the tassels on their prayer shawls. Deuteronomy and Numbers also talk about this, and this is a picture down on the lower left of the modern Jewish prayer shawl, and they have tassels on the corners. In fact, they have tassels all around them. The Pharisees made sure that they had 613 tassels on them, because those were the number of laws that, as they understood it, one was obligated to follow. And then they had long tassels on the corners. The longer the tassels were, and they argued about how long the tassels should be. The longer the tassels were, the more spiritual they pretended to be. And so they wanted their tassels really long, because they wanted to appear to be more spiritual than anyone else. He says, besides trying to be more spiritual than anyone else, you love the seats of honor at banquets, at synagogues, anywhere you want to be. You want to be seen. You want to be looked at by men and women. You want to be acknowledged as among the most important and among the most spiritual people that there are. And in fact, they often did sit near the front of the synagogues so that everyone would see them. It says, and you want to be called rabbi. Rabbi literally means my great one. You want to be called the greatest. Jesus says, do not strive to be called great. He says only one should be called great. Only one should be called teacher or master, and he uses those interchangeably in the next few verses. He says, you are all on the same level. You are all brothers, and you should not aspire, like the Pharisees aspire, to be honored. Do not strive to be called father or leader. And sometimes the elders of the community or of the synagogue or in the Sanhedrin would be called father because they were older and out of respect, or would be called leaders. He says, don't strive to be called father. You have one father, and that is God. And you have one leader or one teacher, and that is the Christ. If you want to become great, become a servant. And if you really want to be important, be humble. This is a complete contrast to what the Pharisees practiced, and also quite honestly what society practiced, and what our society practices too. But Jesus will put those words himself into practice very, very soon, not only as the picture suggests in washing his disciples' feet, but in dying on the cross for lost humanity. He moves, though, from there addressing the crowds and his disciples and potential disciples to what are often called the 7 woes. And those are directed straight toward the Pharisees. So what are woes? What is a woe? What does woe mean? Well, there are 2 different ways that the word woe is used in the Bible. One is like a lament, and is sort of woe is me. It's an expression of sorrow over misfortunes. It's a legitimate way to use the word, and you find it used that way some in the Old Testament. But the predominant way woe is used is as a curse or as a judgment. It's not woe is me, it's woe unto you or woe to you. And the meaning is that one is cursed because of the judgment of God upon him, that God has pronounced a curse there, that the prophet often is pronouncing a curse on the person because of God's judgment. And it's used that way more than 90% of the time in the Old Testament. You find it in the prophets with this meaning over 50 times. And that's almost the only way this meaning of a curse is almost the only way it's used in the New Testament. And it is the only way it's used by Jesus. Now, I'll suggest to you that this is intentional, because Jesus is intentionally speaking in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets. And he is delivering curses to people like the Pharisees because of the judgment of God upon them. And he, acting as God's spokesman, as Messiah, and of course, as God's Son. And Jesus uses the expression over 30 times himself, mostly in Matthew and mostly in Luke. You also find it used the same way in the book of Revelation at least 6 times, that the people who are disobeying God or who are enemies of God are cursed at the time of the last judgment. In Matthew 23, Jesus uses this phrase, woe to you or woe unto you, to deliver a set of very strong judgments or curses against the Pharisees. And these are almost the last words of Jesus' public ministry. So that was one problematic word, woe. What is a hypocrite? Because this word comes up multiple times. Almost every time he uses the term woe in this chapter, he uses hypocrite. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. What is a hypocrite? It's a Greek term that refers to actors wearing masks in Greek plays. In Greek plays, almost always, the actors' faces were covered by masks. and the mask depicted the character that the actor was playing. Sometimes the masks were happy, sometimes the masks were sad, but the mask covered the person's face. One was an actor playing a role, and you could not see the real person. All you could see was the mask. Well, by extension, then, a hypocrite was also anyone who wears a mask, sort of figuratively, and pretends to be something that they are not. It is someone who is insincere, or someone who has different standards for himself or herself when compared to others. It's used by Jesus to refer to those who didn't practice what they preached, or who were different inside from what they appeared to be on the outside. And it's an extremely strong derogatory term. And he applies it here in this chapter and elsewhere to the Pharisees. And it's woe to and hypocrites. It's woe to the Pharisees, and he calls them hypocrites because they set themselves up as guardians, interpreters of God's law, but they fail to live up to their own standards. And the problem is less about sincerity than the failure to understand that their religious practice and teaching is in fact inconsistent with their desire to please God. And in many cases, they had an honest desire to please God. But what they were doing was, and what they were teaching too, was inconsistent with that. They did not understand what it really meant to please God. So it's not just an attack on the Pharisees' ethical contradictions that they did not practice what they preach, but Jesus calling them hypocrites and cursing them in God's name was because of their complete failure as spiritual leaders and teachers to interpret the law correctly and to teach it correctly. And so not only were they failing themselves, but they were leading other people astray. In some respects, and I won't talk about it today, but in some respects, the woes here at the end of Jesus' ministry are in contrast and sort of the opposite of the blessings of the Beatitudes at the beginning. There are 7 woes, there are 7 Beatitudes. And of course, and as the Beatitudes explain a way to truly please God, the woes describe the wrong way to try to please God. And it's very similar to the concept of blessings and curses in the Old Testament law. For the scribes and the Pharisees, the failure is worse than it might otherwise have been if it were just their own failure, because they were the teachers, and they not only misunderstood God's desires themselves, but they taught other people to misunderstand it as well, and they sent people off in the wrong direction and down the wrong road, and a road from which they would never get to God. And that was the problem. As I said, it's like the Old Testament. There are blessings and there are curses. If one followed what God said and followed the correct road to God, one would be blessed. If one did not, one would be cursed. This idea of blessings and curses comes from the time of Moses. And so Jesus, when he is going through these 7 woes of the Pharisees, is taking upon himself the mantle of the prophets of the Old Testament in delivering God's judgment and God's curses on those who have lived opposite of the way in which they should have to please God. So woe number 1, you are cursed by God because, I say that it sounds more significant, just woe to you, because you are cursed by God because the legalism you teach and insist people must follow will shut them out of the kingdom of heaven. Even if people have a sincere desire to please God, if they follow you and your teaching, you will not allow them to follow God. What's implied there is that Jesus has brought and has taught the true way to please God and the true way to gain salvation. And you can find it not only here, but in the Sermon on the Mount and throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And so that the ones who follow him, and only the ones who follow him, can enter the kingdom of God. And so that is the first woe and the first curse by God on the Pharisees who are hypocrites. Verse 14 is in many Bibles printed in brackets or parentheses or something. And that's because it is not in the oldest and best manuscripts of the New Testament. The verse actually comes from Mark 12, and it's a similar list of woes, but it's not at the end of Jesus' ministry. But it's because it's a similar list, the belief is that verse was probably copied from there and put into this list in Matthew as well. The problem is that for some of our early English translations, like the King James Version, they did not have as good a Greek text to work with as we have today. It was based on the best texts that were available at the time, a text really that came from the early 1500s. But in the last 450, 500 years, we found many, many, many additional Greek manuscripts, and we have a much better understanding of exactly what the New Testament said. We have really a 99.999% certainty that what we have now, what we have today, is what the original Greek text said. And it's much better than was available 500 years ago. But from some of the translations based on those early versions of the Greek New Testament, they have a few things like this that are different, that were not in the best manuscripts and the earliest manuscripts that have since been found. And verse 14 is like that. So that's really not part of this list. So it's not one of the woes. Woe number 2, you are cursed by God because, and in this case, it's not because they're seeking converts. Seeking converts is not bad. Jesus, in fact, will tell his disciples to do exactly that in the Great Commission. But if the person seeking converts is himself or herself already a child of hell, meaning one destined to go to hell, because the path you are following is not leading to God, the path is leading somewhere else. If you are following a path that's not leading to God, and you are making converts to go with you down the path that is not leading to God, then you are not serving to increase the population of heaven, you're serving to increase the population of hell. And in fact, since new converts often are more enthusiastic than the one who converted them, that is what creates the expression, they may be twice as much a son of hell as you yourself, and all the time thinking that they are doing what is pleasing God, because that's what you have taught them. And the problem is not seeking converts. The problem is you who have set yourself up to be teachers, teaching them the wrong thing. Woe number 3, you are cursed by God because you are blind and you're nitpickers. We have a proverb about the blind leading the blind, and anytime that the blind lead the blind, bad things happen. Jesus uses oath taking, the taking of oaths, as an example, and he is attacking the kind of scribal nitpicking that went on related to that, but it's just an example. They argued that some oaths were more binding than others, and there was a tendency to substitute the less important ones, the less binding ones, for the more important ones. It was sort of like making a promise and keeping your fingers crossed behind your back, or kids cross their eyes, or you cross your fingers and toes, or whatever. In a sense, that's what they were doing, but they were doing that in oaths that basically were swearing by God. Just don't cross your fingers when you're talking about God. Jesus, in this argument, uses the same reasoning that he used in the Sermon on the Mount. He said that one oath implies another, and eventually all oaths really invoke or involve God. That he says, you're swearing by the temple, or you're swearing by the gold of the temple, or you people are silly. And the arguing about which one is most important, with just kind of a smug, complex philosophy. Well, philosophy, yes. Theology, that's more philosophy almost than theology, really demeans God. It says, how can you be so blind? The blindness, as an example, is really appropriate here. How can you be so blind and not realize that what you're actually doing is demeaning God? The real thing you should be doing is not swearing by oaths at all. And he talks about that quite a bit in the Sermon on the Mount and makes the case for that. Says, but you don't realize that you are blind, and you're trying to practice sort of theological one-upsmanship here. And don't you realize that that's also because of your pride, not because you really want to serve God. If you really wanted to serve God, you would not swear at all. He says, simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. And if you're truthful all the time, people will believe you and you don't have to swear. Number 4, you are cursed by God because, and well, it's not because tithing is bad and that people shouldn't tithe. It says tithing is proper. It says what you are doing, though, you are tithing the spices and the leaves out of your garden. You are putting such an emphasis on tithing the unimportant things that you have forgotten the important things. You're taking the leaves out of your garden. 9 go over here. 1 goes over here for the church. These 9 go here. 1 goes over here for the temple, for the Lord. But you're worried about these leaves. You're worried about spices that are almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and you've forgotten what's really important: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Like the Old Testament prophets, Jesus and God look at the heart. And this is how people can have righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. When Jesus was preaching the Sermon on the Mount, people were amazed. How can that be possible? Well, tithing the unimportant things was not really righteousness at all. That's the easy things to do. It's easy to count 9 pieces of mint go here, 1 piece of mint goes here, 9 dill leaves go here, 1 dill leaf goes here. It's a mechanical thing. Anybody can do that. It's insignificant. The insignificant things are okay, but they are easy to do. What you should really do is concentrate on the important ones. And he says important things like justice and mercy and faithfulness. And when you say what really counts are the leaves you grow in your garden, and you ignore justice and mercy and faithfulness, then 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 you are emphasizing completely the wrong things, and that will not lead you to God. The verse 24 is another example of their blindness and their misplaced priorities. Both a gnat and a camel are unclean, and so uh, depending on one's scruples, they would sometimes strain their drinks to make sure that a gnat had not actually dropped into it. But they said, you worry about the gnat, and because you don't want to swallow this gnat, and yet you are not worried about something as large as a camel. And the comparison between a tiny gnat and a large camel was so the difference was so great that it was almost silly, and may also be a pun in Aramaic because gnat is galma, camel is gamla, and so it was also a pun, really, the way he was saying it. It may even have been a, a well known joke or proverb or common phrase. But the problem here is not that they were tithing. The problem here is they cared only about the simple things and didn't care about the really important things like mercy and justice and faithfulness and matters of the heart. Woe number 5, you are cursed by God because, and this woe and the next one focus on failure to distinguish between external correctness and internal purity. Now, the Pharisees are very concerned with ceremonial cleanliness. And the rabbis argued about which was most important, cleaning the outside or the inside of a dish in terms of ceremonial purification. And should you clean one first? Should you clean the other one first? Should you spend more time on one? Should you spend more time on the other one? Jesus is not talking about that at all. He is using that debate again as an example of a much more important concern. He says, I'm not talking about people or plates, I'm talking about people. And we're talking about external and internal purity of a person, not of a dish. And although the Pharisees worked hard to look clean on the outside, inside, he says, they are full of robbery and greed and self-indulgence and lack of self-control. That's what the words mean. And their blindness, again, and he sort of, why can't you see these things? Their blindness is not being able to see the inside or not being willing to see the inside. He says, clean the inside first, then worry about the outside. Number 6, a similar woe. You are cursed by God because, again, you're worse on the inside than you are on the outside. The tombs around Jerusalem were painted white before a feast. And it was not really to make them beautiful, but it's so people would notice them and not happen to touch a tomb by accident and become unclean. If they became ceremonially unclean by contact with the dead, then they would not be able to participate in something like Passover or like the Feast of Tabernacles or something, because they would be unclean. And so the tombs were painted white so you'd see them, you wouldn't happen to touch one by mistake. And so this is sort of a tongue-in-cheek example. The tombs weren't necessarily painted to make them beautiful, although they were prettier when they were white. But they just look beautiful on the outside. Inside, the tombs are full of dead bodies. They're full of bones. They're full of rotten flesh, all sorts of terrible things. And people should stay away from that. Well, you are you, Pharisees, are like the tombs. You appear to be beautiful on the outside, but you really are rotten on the inside. And people should stay away from you, just like they should stay away from the tombs. We talked about hypocrisy earlier, but it's you have this mask on, and all people can see is the mask, but you are acting as if you were in a play. And who you really are is not the person that is depicted in the mask. And he talks about hypocrisy and lawlessness. The word for lawlessness is really stronger than that implies to us. It really means contempt for and willful violation of the law and wickedness. Not only do they break the law, they habitually do it and they enjoy it. You are full of an attitude that enjoys breaking the law. Sometimes then the word is also translated wickedness. You are just full of evil. Then woe number 7, and woe number 7 is the last woe. You are cursed by God. Why? Because you build tombs? That seems like a strange thing. And why does Jesus end with this particular woe? At first glance, that seems unusual. Well, again, what the Pharisees are like on the inside does not match what they appear to be on the outside. In this case, they're trying to show that they honor God's messengers from the past. They say, if we had been living then, we would have listened to them. We certainly wouldn't have killed them. Talking about the Old Testament prophets. In effect, Jesus says, you are liars. You are lying. You are just like your fathers who murdered the prophets who were sent by God as his spokespeople. Why do I say that? Because that is exactly what you are doing today. You are doing today the same thing that your fathers did to the Old Testament prophets. He says that's true because of your attitude towards God's messengers today, in Jesus' day. And the examples there, perfect examples, are John the Baptist and Jesus himself. He says, in fact, if your fathers had filled up the cup of guilt halfway, part way, you are going to fill it to overflowing with your guilt and sin because of what you are doing now. And it's the what you are doing now, and that's why this is so important. He makes a strong connection to John the Baptist that's clear for anybody to see, because people would have remembered what John said to these very people. Matthew records it in chapter 3, verse 7. He says, you are serpents, you are a brood of vipers, you're a bunch of snakes. And he says, you are going to hell because of what you are. Jesus' own generation, and this is why this is the last woe. Jesus' own generation will be the climax of the Jews' rebellion against God and against God's messengers. It was not just John and Jesus, but the disciples of Jesus who would come after him, who would also be persecuted by that generation. So it's prophecy not just of Jesus' death, although he talks about crucifixion, but it's a prophecy of the Jewish leaders' continued persecution of Jesus' followers in the years to come, of their continued persecution of the early church. That Jesus' death would not be the end of it. It would not be the end of their rejection of God. In fact, even after Jesus had died, had risen, had returned to heaven, they would have more chances to turn back to God. Peter and John preached basically to the Sanhedrin, as did the Apostle Paul. Some of these same people, actually, who were hearing these words, also heard the apostles say, Jesus was the stone that the builders rejected, and he is the Messiah of God. Paul says, this Jesus whom you have crucified is both Lord and Christ. And their rejection of not just Jesus, but all of these messengers that come after him in the disciples and the apostles, sharing the message of Jesus and the message of God, was the what constituted the climax, the extremity of their guilt, because Jesus' birth and his ministry and his death and then resurrection were the culmination of God's plan and God's work throughout the Old Testament to send his Messiah to bring the world back to him. And they had rejected that. They not only rejected God's plan and God's message through the Old Testament, they rejected Jesus himself. And this would be their last chance, the last chance for that generation and the last chance for the nation, and they would fail. The chapter concludes with Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. And the conclusion is, this is what God's judgment will be because of your failure. But Jesus does not really take any pleasure in delivering that. In fact, he's very sorrowful, and that balances some the harshness of his tone in the woes earlier. Jerusalem here symbolizes not just the city, but the whole nation of Israel and their leaders, that they have made their final choice, that God sent Jesus to them to offer them salvation, to offer them a way out, a way forward, a way back to God. And they have, the leaders have, the nation has refused. House may refer to the Jewish nation, but it more likely refers to the temple where Jesus was speaking there. And the word for desolate means really isolated, deserted, abandoned, that God's people have refused him, and God is leaving them. It is now their house, not his. And it's a very similar picture to one to the one that one sees in Ezekiel 10:11, where in Ezekiel's vision you can see the Spirit of God hover over the temple and over Jerusalem and eventually leave the temple. And that's exactly the picture that you get here from Jesus' words. In verse the last verse, Jesus is speaking for himself and for God. And verse 39, he says, I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That was, of course, the phrase that the people used when they were proclaiming him Messiah on Palm Sunday. But that last phrase, the until, is really a conditional. It's not a promise. Jesus is saying, this might be possible, but I don't promise that this will happen. That there will be a new people of God, and I will never come to the temple again. And he doesn't. So, what is it possible to learn from chapter 23, from Jesus' final words and teaching in public? Well, one thing is that leadership has its responsibilities, that we need to practice what we preach, and that one's life should be as clean on the inside as it is on the outside. No masks, where we pretend to be one thing and inside or behind the mask are something else. So very, very important messages for God's leaders, but also for all of God's people. Another message for God's leaders is that, and it will come up again and again through the next few chapters, is that God's leaders are servants, not masters. We'll see Jesus wash the disciples' feet, but we will also see Jesus give up his life on the cross for the sins of humanity and for people who hate him, as a servant, not as a master. Another important point is that God does not only should we be consistent on the inside and the outside, God does not just look on the outside, God looks at the heart. And you cannot fool God. That actions and attitudes of the heart have real and eternal consequences. It did for them, and it does for us. God's patience is long, but God's patience does not last forever. Jesus' listeners would be, and we know from history that they were, held accountable. That Jerusalem and the nation was destroyed, that the Jewish nation was scattered, and that people were never brought back together again, that the temple was destroyed and it has never been rebuilt. But they were held accountable for the refusal not to listen to Jesus and the refusal not to listen even to additional messages and offers from God for salvation after Jesus had been resurrected and was gone. Just as they were held accountable, we also will be held accountable for what we do and what we say and what we have in our heart. There will be very real and eternal consequences. Following Jesus is the only answer. It's quite clear from this passage that people had to come to God on God's terms, not their own. The Pharisees had put together a very elaborate, detailed system on what one needed to do to please God. But that was their idea, not God. We have to come to God on God's terms, not ours, and we have to come to God through Jesus. And Jesus is the only way. There are not multiple ways to God. There are not multiple paths that all lead to the same place. One path will lead to God, other paths don't. They may seem like nice paths, but they don't lead to God. We, however, get to choose which path we walk upon. We can choose the path that will allow us to walk with God and will allow us to be with God, or choose a path that will take us away from God. And we have to choose carefully, because as was the case with the Pharisees and what they were teaching the people, it's not always clear unless we think carefully, that a path won't lead to God. Sometimes people are taught what's, as in the case of the Pharisees, what's not true. But the only path to God is Jesus, and we have to come to God through Him. People sometimes ask, why would a loving God send people to hell? My answer to that always is, God does not send them. They choose to go. They either choose to go on the path that leads to God, or they choose to go on a different path. The path that leads to God can only come through Jesus. And that is the great message of chapter 23. In the next session, we'll look at chapter 24. Jesus is done in the temple. He goes with the disciples out to the Mount of Olives and spends 2 chapters then teaching them about what will happen in the end times, at the end of history. So some interesting, but detailed and sometimes sort of confusing information and material. So it'll be fun to look at. Please join me for the next session when we talk about chapter 24. Thank you. Bye-bye for now.